Good morning. We're continuing our summer sermon series on some of the forgotten figures of the Bible. Today we're going to be talking about Jethro. He was Moses' father-in-law. You can find his story in Exodus, several chapters throughout Exodus. We're going to focus this morning on Exodus chapter 18, verses 5 through 10, and then verses 13 to 23. So I'd invite you to pause now and read Exodus 18, 5 to 10, 13 to 23, and then come on back with me. You know, I don't think that most people have ever heard of Jethro. Although, I think that name sounds like it's ripe for a comeback, because it sounds like a character from the Dukes of Hazzard, or a new country music singer with a permed mullet, like the kids have these days. As we've just read, Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. And Jethro went by several names throughout the Bible. Reuel, Hobab, and then most of the time he was called Jethro. Now the Bible introduces him in the second chapter of Exodus when he meets Moses for the very first time. And that is a story unto itself. At that time, Moses was a slave under Pharaoh, living in Egypt, and he witnessed something which really upset him. He saw an Egyptian beat a Hebrew. Hebrews were, of course, his own people. Moses was so upset, he had such a strong reaction, that he retaliated by killing that Egyptian and burying his body in the desert. The next day, Moses sees two Hebrews fighting, and he tells them, you guys need to cut this out. And they reply to him, well, who made you king, buddy? What are you going to do? Are you going to kill us too, just like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? And so that's when he knew the word was out. He tried to keep his actions quiet, and he had not been successful. People knew what Moses had done. Pharaoh knew what Moses had done, and Pharaoh sent people to find and punish him. Moses fears for his own life, and he flees. He runs away to a place called Midian. Now, this is where he will meet Jethro. One day when he was at Midian, he was sitting by a well, and 7 daughters of the local priest come there to get water for their father's sheep. Now, a group of shepherds chases them away from the well, wanting to keep that water for their own sheep. Now, we already know about Moses that he is not one to take things sitting down from bullies. And so he had a habit of saving people from those who meant them harm. And that's exactly what he did for these 7 daughters of the local priest that day. He watered their sheep, and he protected them from those other shepherds. Now, when the 7 sisters returned to their father later that day, they tell him all about this Egyptian man who saved them and who watered their sheep. They even get home earlier than usual because he helped them accomplish all their chores. Their father insisted that they go find this man, and they invite him to come live on their farm. The father of the 7 sisters, who's the local priest that made such a generous offer, was Jethro. He was a priest, he was a shepherd, he was a father of these 7 daughters. Moses would go on to marry one of his daughters, Zipporah, because Jethro saw how good he was with animals. He was exceedingly good with the animals, with the livestock, and so Jethro puts Moses in charge of the flock. So Moses and Zipporah, they marry, they have 2 sons together, and they enjoy a simple life on their farm until one day God calls out to Moses in a burning bush, urging him to go back to Egypt and to rescue his people from Pharaoh. Now Moses didn't want to go. Did not want to go. He knew all about life in Egypt. He had experienced the horrors of slavery. He knew Pharaoh still wanted to kill him. And quite frankly, he didn't want to leave his family, his wife, his sons, his father-in-law. And so he's struggling with this. God's calling to him. Moses keeps saying no. God keeps calling. He's struggling to make a decision. So what do you do in that situation? When you've got a big life decision that you're struggling with, you go to somebody you trust for some advice. Moses went to Jethro. They have that kind of a relationship. Moses told him what was happening, what God wanted, and Jethro simply says, go in peace. And that's what Moses did. He didn't want to do that. He had fought that for a long time, but he trusted Jethro. He valued his wisdom. He did as he said, and Moses loaded up his family donkey so that he, his wife, and his sons could go back to the last place Moses wanted to go. Now you know what happens next, at least you know the highlights. With God's help, Moses saves the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt, and he takes them on the Exodus. The Exodus was a long, difficult, and trying time for Moses. There were so many things that happened along the way. One in particular that stands out happens between God, Moses, and Zipporah, Moses' wife. At one point, God is so upset at Moses that they have this major disagreement over circumcision, and Zipporah feels as if Moses' life is being threatened by God. And so she interjects, she intercedes on his behalf, and she saved his life that night. They survived so much together throughout the Exodus, Moses and Zipporah and their sons. But in the end, their marriage could not survive the Exodus. Somewhere in between life on the road and the duties of leading the people and arguments with God that began when Moses and God first encountered each other, somewhere in between all those things, Moses divorces her. Not a lot of people realize that about Moses' story either. Zipporah and their sons go back home to Jethro. They leave the Exodus, go back home to Jethro on the farm. It was not all roses and rainbows for Moses and his family. The Exodus took a toll in so many ways personally on them. Now, at this point in the story, Jethro, back to Jethro, Jethro had not seen Moses in years. Not since he left with his family to go to Egypt. Not since any of the plagues. Not since the Exodus. Not since the divorce. And Jethro knows about all these things because Zipporah and Jethro's grandsons have now come home. And he decides it's time to go pay Moses a visit. Now, you might expect Jethro to be upset with Moses for divorcing his daughter. And assuredly he was. But Jethro does not voice that. He does not show it. Instead, when he goes to see Moses, he gets right to the heart of the matter. He tells Moses how concerned he is about him. Jethro says, I've heard all about what God is doing in your life, in the life of your people, and in the Exodus. What God has done in liberating them is wonderful. Wonderful. But what you are doing, Moses, is not good. He says, you are surely going to wear yourself completely out. This task is too heavy for one person to bear alone. He was referring there to the role that Moses had taken on as leader of the people. He was not only guiding the Exodus, but he was also sort of serving as Judge Judy of the community. He was resolving all the people's quarrels. Jethro told him he was wearing out, trying to do it all alone, which was a nice way of saying, you were a real jerk to my daughter and my grandsons, but I know you've got a good heart, and we need to get you back on track. Now, in order to get him back on track, Jethro suggests that Moses take a couple of concrete steps. One, teach the people the law. That way they can understand it themselves and solve some of their own disputes instead of having to come to you like Judge Judy all the time. 2, Jethro says, you need to hire some help. Find some trustworthy leaders who can help solve some of the more serious problems or matters that arise for you. And number 3, you need to save your time for only the most difficult cases before your people, because that's enough for you to handle, and they're that important to your community. So the question was, how would Moses take this advice? Whenever God gave Moses advice, it typically didn't go so well. He had to hem and haw and argue and think about it, and trial and error. But Moses took Jethro's advice really well, just like he always had. He trusted him. He agreed to make those changes that Jethro suggested, and they made everyone's life easier. That wasn't the only thing Jethro gave Moses that day. He also gave him his family back. You see, he brought with him Zipporah and the sons, their 2 boys that day, and they were reunited with Moses on the Exodus. Now, there are a lot of complicated details in between, but that's the gist of what happened that day with Jethro. My favorite verse from the story of Jethro is Exodus 18, verse 24, which simply includes the line, Moses listened to his father-in-law. So simple, so rare, so powerful. Moses could have just ignored Jethro. After all, he wasn't his father-in-law anymore. Moses could have, out of some sense of respect, just nodded his head, but not actually made any changes. After all, Moses was in charge, not Jethro. These weren't even Jethro's people. Moses could have refused to listen to Jethro at all. Didn't even have to have a conversation with him. He was mighty busy. But instead, Moses listened. He listened. He didn't just hear what Jethro had to say. He listened to what he was conveying to him. I think a lot of the credit for that response that Moses has goes to how Jethro handled this situation. He was trustworthy. He was honest, even if it was hard. He was loving, even through those hard times. I do a fair bit of couples counseling. Most everything comes back to communication. And it isn't often what people say that causes problems. More often than not, almost all the time, it's how people say something that causes problems. Just think about Jethro in this circumstance. If Jethro had rolled into town and said, Moses, you are a terrible leader, and if you want your people to survive, then you need to make some major changes, bucko, then that never would have worked. Never would have worked. Not the advice, not the relationship between the 2 men, not the reunification of Zipporah and the kids, but instead, Jethro rolls into town with the same message, but he says it differently. He says, what God is doing here on the Exodus is miraculous. I am so glad that your people are free now and that you're leading them. But Moses, I am concerned for your well-being. I care about you. I want you to be around for years to come. What if you made some changes that would help you and your people live a little bit easier? It's the same message. It's the same message, but he says it in a totally different way. And that's our lesson today from the story of Jethro. Jethro spoke the truth in love. And because of that, Moses listened. He heard and he changed. Speak the truth in love in your life, and those who matter to you will listen. Amen.